for all the people out there with a dream that just want to be seen. Yeah, my dream's bigger than the average.
Welcome to episode 5 of the Be Seen podcast. Today, we have a legend. We have Steve Bernstein, Hollywood cinematographer, screenwriter, and director. Sir, it is an honor to have you on today. Thank you.
Well, what an intimidating introduction. I hope the legend, I don't know. It's certainly been a matter of survival, and I seem to have survived longer than some. So I guess that gives me some sort of status. Whether it's earned or not, I don't know. But thank you very much. It's very kind.
It's my honor. Thank you. Steve, share with us your journey. How did you get into all of this? How did it happen?
I think in England there used to be, I think it was the Sunday Times magazine or one of those, or the Observer. At the back of the issue, there would be someone talking about their lives, and they would talk about they would wake at 5 a.m. They would write a novel by lunch. They would make great sacrifices. They would run 2 miles, and you just thought, my God, these people have a discipline that's unimaginable, and are constantly inspired and work extremely hard, and therefore have earned whatever they've achieved. I realize now that was part of a fictive universe. I mean, maybe they imagined that's what their lives were like, but that's not what life is like. So I would love to say that I was the author of some grand plan where I envisioned where I would go, and it was by design. But it was only partially by design. Very often it was by accident, a mixture sometimes of blind ambition, some ability, some happy errors and accidents, sometimes opportunity, and mixed with catastrophes. But in giving the overview of all that, I would observe that the catastrophes that occurred along the way very often provided opportunities later, or gave me insights into my own nature or into the human condition, which made me a better cinematographer or a better director or a better writer or a better book writer or whatever it is. And I realized that as we go on our individual journeys, if we don't have a certain measure of catastrophes and errors and of misdirections, we don't then get to see the bigger picture of what's beyond our small world that we think where all the significance lies. Particularly for screenwriters, if you only live in film and only write about film, and you only read books about film, then ultimately you're only going to make films that other people have made, variations thereof, but you'll only do those things. It's living a full life and doing many different things that gives color, depth, and complexity to your understanding of what it is to be human, what it is to be a writer, what it is to live a full life and create characters that have a dimensionality that people find compelling. So as for me, I was born in the U.S., spent a long time in the U.K., originally intended to be a writer. Originally, I was meant to be a playwright. I did work at the BBC. I was being trained to be a very fine and responsible BBC director. They sent me around the world doing both documentary, then working on short form, long form fiction. And then an accident happened, a shameful accident, but one that facilitated me and others. Some guy named John Roseman I met, and his idea was that there were a lot of bands around in the 80s, late 70s, and they had no way of accessing the all-important A&R men who would decide whether they had a career or not. So he had this notion that we could put a camera up against a white background and film the band performing, put it on 3/4-inch videotape, which was all the rage then, and give it to the record companies, the A&R men. They could see these bands and discover them. And he knew that I worked at wherever I worked, and he asked if I could borrow some equipment on weekends, which I guess we're past the statute of limitations, which I did. And we filmed some of these bands. And he then thought, wouldn't it be great if we did some themes and the bands could pay a little bit more than the, I think, 30 quid they were paying at the time. And we could have maybe some dancers in the background or actually go out on location. And maybe if the band has a lot of money, we could shoot on 16 millimeter film. And suddenly we and others began doing more and more of these, and that was the birth of the music videos. And then I shot some huge music videos, every major band imaginable, and got some notoriety. I'm compressing all this into a very short space of time, otherwise I'll bore your viewers for hours, but I got kind of recognized by some commercials companies, RSA, and Spots. I worked with a lot of very well-known directors, went on to do features. Interestingly, I worked with Tony Kaye. At the beginning of his career, I shot Tony's first commercials, and Tony, of course, became a legend. This is one of those strange actors. Tony, I think by his own admission, is a strange bloke. Famously, he left Saatchi's, as you know, and running through the main floor there with a pamphlet throwing in the air, hundreds of them saying, Tony Kaye is the best director in the world. There's a magazine called Commercials. He took out a full-page ad that Tony Kaye is better than Orson Welles, and so on. Strange, but effective. And Tony began doing commercials. But unlike any other commercials director I ever worked with, I mention him not because Ridley Scott and others aren't great, but because Tony's view was that the mistake we make in production is the belief that anything's important besides the end product. And he said, nothing's important besides the end product. Not money, not crew, not loyalty, not politics, not how people perceive you, just what you're creating. So we would be halfway through lighting, and I'd hear the cameras whirring behind me. And Tony would pick up a camera and be shooting through my legs. He'd be shooting people on set. He'd be shooting objects that he found interesting. We would get in a cab early in the morning before a shoot and go to Samuelson's when I was still around. And he'd go into the filter room and be asking me what different filters do. And finally, he would just say, just take all of them. And we'd go with hundreds of filters, hundreds of lenses, hundreds of different cameras, 8 millimeter, 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter, early video cameras. And he would shoot with all of them with no seeming plan, except that nothing was of value except the end product. And we don't know what the end product's going to be. And I'll come back to this because it's applicable to everything. Mm-hmm. And we one time shot 150,000 feet of film in a day, which is kind of the amount of film you shoot on a feature film in one day. And then he'd go to the editing room and just play and invent and discover. It was radical and it was different. And essentially what he was saying was, if you make a plan, it subverts the ultimate quality of what you might create. Because in making a plan, you're thinking about structure and order and limitation. Whereas the process of creative work is actually a process of discovery. And while you're doing the work, you discover things that you never would have imagined had you tried to plan it first. So he was the anti-planner. Of course, later on, got us some trouble, and the British Airways ad, which £1 million budget went £1 million over. So, that sort of thing. So it isn't always responsible. It can be dangerous, but it's significant. And there's a danger in success. And I tracked this all the way through my career, is that every time I would have a success, when I then left the UK, I had shot some films in the UK. A friend of mine doing a film in Mexico that run into some trouble, a film called Like Water for Chocolate, which became quite famous. And there'd been a falling out between the cinematographer and the director. They had run out of money. They only had a few weeks, I was told, to shoot in Mexico. Would I go over and finish it? My friend was a guy named Steve Bernstein and became a very well-known cinematographer, working in the Marvel universe now, and a great friend. And we've collaborated on many things, including SWAT, so on through the years. But in this individual instance, he had just moved to America. He couldn't do this job, asked if I could do it. I went to Mexico for a couple of weeks. And of course, 6 months later, I was still there, shooting and shooting and shooting. And again, chaos. I remember one day, one of our principal actors, who was also one of the drivers, because we all had to share work, backed a car up over the director's foot. They got into a fist fight. The director fired him on the spot. We're in the middle of the Mexican desert. It's called Cunha. And we realized that without this actor, we couldn't make the film. So Alfonso Aro, who was the director, wouldn't give in. So we had to hire another actor and reshoot the 40 or 50 scenes we shot with this actor. So, and of course, an accident, literally an accident, an act of complete madness, a director who, I love Alfonso, but a bit of a madman. And yet, through that madness, this film became the highest grossing foreign language film in US history. And I think it's a result of that madness, that certainly obstacles, the mother of invention. So when you can't do things the way you want to, you do things differently. But also when you are an iconoclast, when you, like Tony and like Alfonso, have a different view of the world than others, and you literally reinvent the wheel. People will constantly say to you, don't try to reinvent the wheel. To the contrary, reinvent the wheel, and it will make you better. So I end up, after that film, it has some huge notoriety in America. I get invited to the States. I meet lots of very famous people, not realizing that my countrymen in Los Angeles think that lying is not something that's a moral question, but one of convenience. So I was promised lots of projects of every size and nature because I was a hot commodity, an American expression, but I was something that could be marketed or sold so that I could attach to a project that would be more likely to raise money. And that was peculiar. To this point, going to what happens when you have some success. People kept saying to me, I'd love you to shoot it like you shot Like Water for Chocolate. And I would listen and I would shoot something like that. And then I would have some studio films that I would shoot and I would have some success. And the money was obscene compared to what I was getting in the UK. And then suddenly you start buying things you don't need and you start doing projects that you don't want to pay for the things you don't need. And then you want to sustain that. And then you try to figure out what your orthodoxy is, what is giving you that success. So rather than becoming more radical, because the radicalism is what provides you with the success, you become more conservative. When you start working for a studio and there's millions of dollars, millions and millions of dollars that are at risk, people are interested in you being a safe pair of hands. They don't want you to show up and say, yeah, I know I've got 3 trucks of lights. I know I got 4 generators, but I'm just going to do one little handheld light here, just in the foreground and not light anything else. And they're going, what about the trucks that we ordered? I've never seen anyone else do that. This is very dangerous. Where's the beauty? We can't see the money, as one producer said to me. We're paying for that actor, the money. We want you to light them beautifully. And suddenly the people they hire because they're artists, they then try to subvert as artists. And I had a very good run. I did huge movies. I shot Murder 1600 with Wesley Snipes. Again with Gabby, I shot one of the Blade films, the action stuff on Blade. I got known for action. I did all the big action stuff on SWAT, doing lots of the big comedies, Bulletproof, because later I would go on to do White Chicks, Half Baked, Waterboy, Little Man, huge projects, huge money. And I mention the money because it's significant philosophically. It's the thing that subverts us as artists. It pays the bills. Mm-hmm. It takes away a lot of misery, but it is the temptation that can destroy you if you want to be something besides a worker. And I think we all want to be something besides that as writers and as creators. And then I guess the great crisis happened. And it's a compression of a lot of years. I wrote a book about film production there, as you know. I was still writing plays. I was directing plays. A lot of other stuff was going on, but this is what was meant to be a short summation, which turned into a long summation. I apologize. Shooting SWAT, big action stuff, great fun. We took the LA Public Library, 26 cameras. We created a false glass front. We had a helicopter, fake helicopter, but still 3/4 size, crash. We had a couple hundred extras. We had slow motion, high speed motion, stunt people everywhere, cranes, Moscow lights, enormous. And we blew up the front of this library. And that was one of the smaller sequences I did. Then there was this caravan of police cars that we blew up with rockets. Again, 23, 26 cameras, hundreds of stunt people jumping up in the air, cars being blown 20, 30 feet in the air. And then bigger, we had a plane landing on the 2nd Street Bridge in Los Angeles. Well, there's a shootout with Sam Jackson, Colin Farrell, and we actually landed a fake plane on this bridge, pulling it with cables, and squibs going off everywhere, and a 4-ton plate that would pull this plane down the bridge. It was incredible. And seemingly, at least my testosterone was telling me, this is what I always wanted to do. But I felt a very odd kind of emptiness. Very proud of my work on that. Film was ultimately very successful. I made lots of films that made over $100 million. Waterboy made $1 billion. I mean, in that sense, a Hollywood sense, I was their blue-eyed boy. But this didn't feel somehow like what I wanted to do. I was a playwright, I was a writer, I wrote books, poetry, making a lot of money, buying things, bought an airplane, bought a boat. None of those things you need in life, as it turns out. And it sounds like, oh, I was, oh, well, he's bragging, we're a grand life. It wasn't that grand. There was this profound, overwhelming, destructive ennui. And I mean, destructive I was always in my life. Even when I was young, self-destructive, and became more self-destructive in ways that I didn't recognize, which possibly is a malady that a lot of writers share. And then I didn't know how to get out of it. It was a train. I was accumulating objects. I had a reputation. I wasn't turning any work down. Probably worked on about 100 movies and TV shows now. It's a lot. And then I got a phone call from a little film in Florida that was in deep trouble. That one of the first people I worked for in America had Clark Peterson. And when I first arrived in America, I wasn't in the union yet. I worked on some very little films with him, and they were awful, but still educational, because until you do a film for no money, you don't know how to make a movie. And he was partially responsible for my success, I guess, because I learned about the American film industry from him. And this film in Florida was going to shut down. It shot 2 days. About a day and a half of the material was unusable. They had fired were in the process of firing the cinematographer. It was her first time director, had really no idea what she was doing, or so the producer's view of that was. In fact, she was a genius, but they didn't know it yet. It was an actress who was a very beautiful woman, but had always been in support roles because of her beauty, and no one considered her substitute. And I said, look, I'm in the middle of SWAT. I'm earning $20,000 a week, whatever it was. I'm not going to come down and do your little shitty $3 million movie. But thanks, Clark. And he goes, well, just read the script. So I read the script. I go, kind of interesting script. But he goes, speak to the director. I said, Clark, I make a habit of not speaking to first-time directors because it's just going to be a time waster. And she's probably doing some catastrophic construct that it will be unwatchable, even if it's makeable. But I spoke to her, and I thought she was not only articulate, but had a very clear vision, and kept talking about how important the art was. And this is about 1 million miles from where I was in my career at that point, art. And how she believed in the project. And she started talking about the arc of the main character, and how it was both tragic, but ultimately edifying, because there, for the grace of God, go all of us. So in some strange act of madness, I made an arrangement to back out of SWAT. We only had a couple of weeks left to shoot. And we'd done all the giant material already. And for basically what my per diem was, I went to go work on this awful little film in Florida, and arrived, and without being unkind, fired, I think 80% of the crew, sat with this actress and this director and explained my methodology and how things had to change. We replaced the camera gear, we replaced the lighting method, everything else. And I realized, looking at their schedule, there was no way that they were going to complete on time or quality. I also realized after the first day of shooting with this actress that she was very intuitive, and the marks were driving her crazy. And she's trying so hard to, like me, do the things that have made her successful. Be professional, always hit your marks, be on time, be someone that studios could rely on to keep writing your checks. So what we decided was we're going to radically madly, Tony Kaye style, Alfonso Aro style, changed the way we were going to shoot this. I fired the grips and electrics, brought in some friends from Los Angeles, and we decided that the lights were going to move, not be stationary, so we could work faster. So we took paper lanterns and we put them at the end of poles. And the cameras would no longer be on tripods. Everything would be handheld, and I would handheld so I could see what I was shooting at the time. We had radios that would attach to the people moving the lights, and I would say, now, as she says that line, move the light forward, move the light to the right. Now, this all just has to writing, and we'll come back to that. And we did all those things. And we said to the actors, don't worry about the marks. Go wherever you want, wherever your intuition takes you. And don't worry about stopping or starting. Whatever you want to do, we will follow. And I said to the director, if I feel inspired and I want to move the camera over here suddenly to get a different angle, absolutely, let's go for it. And we did it. And we were, on a feature, if you do 10, 12 setups a day, you're going quick. 15, very quick, you're an independent film. We were doing 50, 60 setups a day through radically altering the notions of the way a film should be shot, using paper lanterns. And we shot this film, and we had a great time, and it was inspirational. We had no money. We stayed in an awful little hotel. I mean, really awful hotel, brown stains everywhere. Yeah.
I think I know what this film is. I think I've worked it out.
I think you might. And then, of course, we went away for a few months. I got a call saying, we can't sell the film. No one wants it. We got a lecture from Harvey Weinstein about how no one would ever watch a film about this subject matter. And of course, as you rightly probably already thought, the film was Monster. It went on to win the Golden Globe, the Oscar, the Berlin. It won everything on the planet. Charlize became one of the biggest actresses in the world. And Patty Jenkins, first-time director, went on to direct Wonder Woman 1, Wonder Woman 2, one of the nicest people in the world, and everything altered for all of us all at once because we radically changed the approach to the orthodoxy about the way films should be made. And then, at the time, it offered opportunities for me as a director. I went on to do a film called Decoding Annie Parker, which I wrote and directed with Helen Hunt, Samantha Morton, Aaron Paul, and highly regarded, important movie, I think, in many respects. That led to Last Call with John Malkovich, a dear friend of mine, who responded to the script. And that led to GRQ, the film I just did. And that led to the film that I'm starting shortly. So things have worked out. But all this comes to this idea that you opened with of this journey and this cross-germination, how things, or I started with how each thing informs the other. I just have written a book about creative process for big publishers, and comes out later this year. And what they were interested in is how me, with a background as a writer, as a cinematographer, as a producer, and as a director, approach creative work differently. And what I discovered is that I'm a different writer because I was a cinematographer. I know now, as a writer, when it's better to use a simple composition, an asymmetrical composition, a composition where you can't see the main character at all, it's just a silhouette, how a camera move, a push in or a pan can change the audience perception of a character and of an action. And it was better to do that than to write that scene. As writers, we're inclined to overwrite because we want to communicate ideas on the page, because we're using that screenplay very often to sell our concepts or to explain to an actor or to a director what our concept is. But we don't mediate the world only through spoken language. There's many things that are visceral in this world that impact us profoundly. And next time we go to an art gallery, we look at paintings, although there are exceptions, there aren't a lot of words on paintings. We're not looking at them for the narrative of the story. There's not a beginning, a middle, and the end in a painting. And yet it moves us. When we hear music, sometimes there's a narrative, but very often there isn't. And yet it moves us. When we go into a building that has spectacular architecture, there's not a beginning and a middle and the end, but it moves us and alters us. All these things are visceral, primal, elementary things that are affect the way we mediate our world. And yet, as writers, we're inclined to ignore them because we've been given this brief: tell a story, and everything is about story. Here's the revolutionary notion: films aren't exclusively about story. It's not only about storytelling. The sacredness that all these books go on about storytelling. Yeah, storytelling is ancient, but that doesn't mean it's sacred. People experience a film in many different ways that are not only about story, but about many other things as well. And what I've discovered as a writer is I have to engage an audience at all those levels for a film to be successful. Right now, I'm in the process of editing my new film, GRQ. It's about a guy who's got an insuperable obstacle he has to overcome. I wrote a story that was a novel, which people responded to the novel in a big way, and that led to the film, which is great. But as we go through each scene, I'm using Chris Gill, who's one of Danny Boyle uses him as an editor. As I go through each scene and we look to see whether it's effective or not, sometimes the dialogue is enough. Sometimes the performances are enough. But sometimes we've discovered that to push the camera in at a key moment entirely alters the drama. To change the lighting, to have a high contrast lighting, have someone in silhouette, changes the drama. To have music at particular moments, or there's a thing called a shepherd tone. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but a shepherd tone is a musical note that is separated by one octave from two other musical notes. Two of those notes are going down, one is neutral. The one that's loudest is neutral. But because of the relationship to those diminishing tones, it creates an audio illusion. So you think the sound is going up, whereas in fact it's flat. Something that Hans Zimmer uses all the time. So when you put a shepherd tone in any scene, it drives an audience mad. Right away, they become tense. Tense because of the dialogue? No. Tense because of the narrative? No. Tense because this audio effect affects audiences in visceral ways, just the way compositions do, just the way camera movements do, just the way the musical track, the score affects them, just the way the rhythm of editing affects them. All these things alter the audience's experience of the character, the scene, and the movie. And if you don't include those as part of the devices that you mechanize, that you use, then you're subverting yourself as a writer, as a filmmaker. Now, you might think, well, no, screenplay should include those things. I think screenplay probably should, because a screenplay is the blueprint for the film that's subsequently made. And when I write screenplays, I include those things. Is that the orthodoxy? Is that what's approved of by the books and the people who write cover for studios? No. But does it work? Yeah, it does, because it allows the reader or the producer to have a real vision of the film you're subsequently going to make. I also write commentaries in my script. Famous, where it all began with a writer named Black, who years ago was describing his first major studio film. And he said, he lives in a house like I will live in someday if you buy this script. And that was actually a note in the screenplay. So I write commentaries in the screenplay to make the screenplay enjoyable to the reader. Very often they say, don't do stage directions, because actors don't like that. And they don't, by the way. But actors don't read my first screenplay. Investors and producers do. And very often it's investors who don't know anything about filmmaking. So what I do for them is I write kind of a novel in screenwriting form that is a delight to read. I describe sequences. I describe camera movements. I talk about the character's inner life. So when someone reads it, they can like it and enjoy it, and then understand what will ultimately be realized later when I go out to shoot. And then, this is one of my journey. It's a long journey.
I love this journey. You go as long as you want. I love it. I'm learning so much myself.
And then I discovered, as I thought back to Tony, where this began, when I thought back to Alfonso, I thought about Patty Jenkins, who directed Monster, and all the other lessons that I've learned, including a lot of the theater work I did, where I was trying to do something radical. I was to draw attention to myself, but I was looking for new ways of communicating. And I realized that the way we write is crazy. We write outlines first. There's nothing worse than writing an outline. Outline is the work of the devil. Outline destroys all writing. There'd be 10,000 more great novels if the word outline had never been invented. Because the minute you plan, you diminish. Things become about narratives that you have to reach by certain page counts, or certain things have to be achieved, or characters significantly serve narrative. So a character will speak to disguise exposition, to give information to the audience, and set them up for what happens later. Now, I said at the beginning, my life has been a series of accidents, and I realize that everyone's life is a series of accidents. Every day is a series of accidents. There is no ultimate plan. We think there's a plan, but then our life intervenes. To replicate that experience is one of the most important things a writer can do, to replicate the real experience of life in all its madness and chaos. So to do that, you have to have inconsistencies. You have to have characters that have agendas besides the narrative agenda. They have to have predispositions, interests, eccentricities, all of which have nothing to do with the forward progress of the story, which is counterintuitive and runs against all the orthodoxies of every writing book that I've ever seen about how to write a screenplay. But then you have people like a mentor of mine in the UK, Mike Leigh, who works a lot with improvisation. And how many Oscars now has Mike Leigh or his actors been nominated for? And the reason for that isn't just because the improvisation is leading to great performances, which it does, but I would say it goes to the inconsistency and complexity of character. And when Mike Leigh goes off and have these characters live the lives of the characters they're going to be playing, it creates naturally inconsistencies in narrative, because they're not going to work at a butcher shop to serve the narrative that Mike has outlined, because he hasn't created an outline. They go and they work at a butcher shop, or in Sally Hawkins' case, become a supply teacher to learn about this character and to bring things to the character that ordinary writers never bring. I think all writing should be based on improvisation. Maybe not the improvisation of the actors, but the improvisation of the writer. And to facilitate this, I have a methodology that a few other writers use, but I use absolutely, which I always begin writing without an outline and without any plan except a very general one. And I write very, very quickly. Writing slowly destroys quality. Writing carefully destroys quality. And the most important lesson of all, writing well means you'll never write a good screenplay, because you parse out each individual word, you plan, you think of its impact, and you think of your ultimate responsibility to your denouement conclusion. And your characters will talk to serve that narrative and won't talk naturally. And when the audience sees the film and they don't recognize the character from the ordinary non-cinematic world, and they realize the character is a contrivance, you've subverted that character's ability to influence, move, and alter that audience. So I will write a screenplay in 4 days, 6 days, 7 days. I think I wrote my novel in 2 weeks, writing very, very quickly. And most importantly, my greatest skill, write terribly. I will, if I forget a character's name, I'll just change the name in that sentence. If I forgot where the narrative was going, I go in a different place. I'll have 3 different endings. I'll be completely irresponsible in any possible way and create a mess, a 200-page mess. And then, talking about sacred, I will then read this 200-page mess and I will discover character. I will discover narrative. I will discover a story, but only after I've written, because writing is a process of discovery. If I was to outline first, I would have diminished everything that follows, because everything would have been following that outline. When I speak to writing students and I say, after they've done the outline, tell me about the character, they can tell me about the character for about a sentence. And then they immediately get to the narrative. And then he or she did this, then they did this, then they did this, and they got to overcome this obstacle. I said, no, don't tell me anything about the story. Tell me about the character. Who is their first love? What is their greatest fear? What do they want to achieve? And every writer I've ever gone through this process with struggles. And my question for everybody, how can you write something when you have no understanding of character? Or worse, when you have an absolute understanding of character, and that character is only serving narrative, that they're only about the story. But when you write first, you discover so much about your character. They say things and do things that you can't quite fathom or understand because you just thought it was interesting at the time. There was some intuition you had about why the character would say this. The second stage of my process is after reading that 200-page mess, I then create backstory. I then will make up backstory for every character, never based on narrative. I will never say his brother was killed in a sawmill, so later when he becomes an important pop star, he's thinking of his brother in some awful flashback sequence. Never that way. I'll think about a person's first girlfriend or boyfriend, their first traumatic experience, where they went to school, what sports team they supported, what they wanted, what dreams were destroyed, what dreams they still have, who they know, who they've met, what their financial position is, what it was, what it will be in the future, possibly. And I create a backstory that has nothing to do with my story. But then when I go on to write the next script, which is a combination of the 200-page mess and the backstory, suddenly it's effortless. And suddenly the dialogue is energized, because the characters will be talking not only about narrative elements, but then some reference to some incident that happened in their childhood, which the audience will never know about. But they do know that people talk about things that they don't know about. And there's a vermicitude to it. They go, oh, okay, this is a real person. Suddenly they'll go off on some tangential obsession, as people do. Suddenly in the middle of some crisis, they'll be talking about something entirely different from what is relevant to the narrative. And you create, in that process, compelling characters. You discover something about yourself. You discover something about human nature. Your dialogue improves, all because you violated the orthodoxy. And then as you write, rather than being trapped by the requirements of what you're told a screenplay must or mustn't have, you just put whatever in the screenplay you want. If it's a description, if it's a note to the reader, if it's a bit of poetry, all of which I've done. Let's tell you about my novel. I wrote my novel in free verse poetical style. That's all it is. That it's sometimes like Tristram Shandy, Lawrence Stern book. I'll write down the page at an angle. Sometimes there'll be one word on the page. The punctuation is strange and peculiar. 10 pages have no punctuation at all. I'll have two characters talking on facing pages, and everybody loved the book. Most everybody. I've got one person ringing me back saying, I got your book, there's something wrong with the formatting. And I said, no, there's nothing wrong with the formatting. That's the way it's written. But the reason it worked was because by writing in free verse and poetry, I no longer felt the obligation to write in paragraphs. I no longer felt a need to be limited by the agreed upon form. And by freeing myself of form, like in screenwriting, like in cinematography on Monster, like Tony Kaye with spending huge sums of money and using cameras as they were not intended to be used, like Alfonso Aro just recasting because he felt like it. I realized that writing, creative process, is about liberating yourself from what other people tell you is correct. I realized that whatever you then do has to facilitate you as a creative artist, which means, again, you have to work without limits. You have to take risks, and you have to realize that creative process is not about having an idea and then putting it on a page or a canvas. Creative process is a process whereby you discover ideas through doing it. I think if you look at the history of painting, you'll see that some of the greatest painters discovered their notions about painting through painting, not about outlining the painting before they did it. So that's where I've gotten to now, that it's become my own orthodoxy, my own liberating orthodoxy. And what's great now is that when I sit down early in the morning, 5 a.m., whatever it is, and decide I have to do my 4 hours of writing, very often I'll write a free verse novel, and I'll write 60 pages, dictating with this little device, because I feel, well, I'll go for a walk and have a headphone, and I use a voice recognition program. I pass that to a thing called Rev, trying to remove all the obstacles to intuitive creative process. And if I type and worry about my awful spelling or my grammar, or that someone might not be able to read what I've written, it slows me down. So when I dictate without an outline, just the only rule I have is I must write for 4 hours. And I'll write and write and write. Sometimes it's utter nonsense, but now I've got piles and piles of pages at my desk at the moment of stuff that I then flip through and discover things that become one of the 8 screenplays I'm working on right now that have, most of which have been commissioned by people. If they saw what I've got for them right now, they would want their money back. But 6 months from now, 5 months from now, when I take these awful first drafts and make them into something else, there would be something of value. So that's kind of my journey. And what's significant is that right now, as I'm editing this film, I'm discovering the same thing with editing. It was based on a novel, based on a screenplay, based on actors I directed. And I had an intention for every scene by the time we were shooting. You have to do that because lots of money's being spent each day. But now, as I come to each scene, I'm thinking, I don't know if I want the character saying this. If I just have this character silent, it might be more interesting. And I can write this little bit of voiceover. I can change the order of this. And I realize that, again, the inclination is to say, I want this thing done and I want it out. So I better go with the structure that I created. But as I liberate myself from that structure, and when I say to Chris Gill, Chris, I've got 150 pages of editing notes, which I did. And I sent them to him. And the first thing Chris did, like he did on my last film, was phone me. He said, you don't want me to read these. And I said, why? He said, because then I'll be doing what you want. And you don't want me doing what you want. Because whatever I do will either be good and different, or it will make you think about what you did do, so you do it differently. But let me do my own cut of your film. And he did. And it was annoyingly, radically different from what I intended. And it was also, at times, brilliant. So some of his notions I just took wholesale. Other ones made me re-examine everything else I did. And then we did another cut, and I sent it back to him, which probably drove him crazy. And now he's doing yet another process, and on we go. The film will be different from where it began, but it will be better than it was when it began because of this openness to process. But remember, everyone should remember that all the forces that will be applied to you as you become successful will to not to do the things that made you successful, to become conservative, to become a safe pair of hands, and to do what everybody else is doing. The studios have all read McKee. They all believe in the 3 acts. They all believe in the hero's journey. They all believe that this is the only way to do a film. All this stuff is valuable to read. You should read the hero's journey. You should read McKee. You should know what the studios want. But if you make that your orthodoxy and believe there's only one way to write, you'll be destroying a large part of what's best about you, which is your unique way of mediating the world. And think for a moment about like if you've ever been drunk or ever been on drugs, about how you say things and do things that you don't normally do when you're responsible and sober. I'm not advocating getting drunk, but I am advocating altering your understanding of the world and doing things differently. I'm sure without alcohol, half the relationships in the world wouldn't have begun. And there's a reason for that, because people talk subtext when they're drunk. I'm suggesting that we should all take a radical view to our creative process and kind of have a creative drunkenness.
I think that's wonderful. When you speak about subtext, could you explain more about that for our listeners? What is subtext in a screenplay?
Well, we have multiple selves, all of us. We have a public self, a safe self. When I speak to a producer, I'm not going to tell them that I think they're a reprehensible human being, even though I may think that because it doesn't serve me at that moment. So subtext is many things, but one of the things it is the things that we daren't say. The secret self, our secret view, our secret understanding of the world. Second thing is it's also our emotional life. That is, we do things and we take actions, but the actions may have an ostensible meaning to others, the reason we're doing things, but we have a different meaning. We have a different reason for them, going to what we actually intend. So when we write a character, they may say things that seem to have a public meaning in terms of the narrative, but there may be a reason that they're saying things that we don't see, or we don't explain, or we don't understand. There may be something else that they're implying. There may be something else that they're believing. which is the text that's unspoken, and there's a subtext. There's an exercise we do with actors very often to free them. But by the way, the same rules apply to performance. I love improvisation, not because I always use improvised lines in my films, but because it takes the actors to places they might not otherwise go if they're not open to these intuitions. But I'll have characters speak subtext to each other. So rather than walking in and meet the girl or the boy, whoever it is, you say, nice to meet you. I read your book. I thought it was interesting. Instead, you come in and you say, I think you're really beautiful. I'm very unhappy. And I think that if you would only sleep with me, I would alter my understanding of the world. And I really desire you. What do you think? What do you think? Now, it's probably not a good approach to a potential life partner. So we don't speak that way. But if you have your characters, your actors speak that way to each other, and then you go back and do the scene, and you know the subtext, and the other character knows the subtext, suddenly every line is imbued with an unspoken meaning or potential meaning. We know kind of our own subtext, but very often we don't. We never know another character's subtext, but we think that we might. So that informs the scene about what is unspoken. And I think that's probably the best definition of subtext. I would nuance that slightly in saying that the idea that we understand our subtext is not necessarily true. I think the process of performance is very often about discovering what we really mean. So a character begins one place thinking they want something, and then might discover by page 50 or by the end of the film, they really want something entirely different than what they thought they wanted. In my new film, the character thinks all he needs is money to survive, to bail himself out of this catastrophic situation. And he makes every possible mistake he can make in the pursuit of that. And then, I won't give the film away, but when a much bigger catastrophe, the one he thought was going to unfold, unfolds, he re-examines what he thought was important and discovers something wholly different of value. Subtext.
Subtext, does it come out within their body language? For instance, so like I'm thinking one thing, but I'm saying something else, but those things are linked in with my intentions. This is what it is.
Absolutely. Subtext comes in lots of different ways. It could come out in encoded speech, that a person could say one thing, but as you listen to it, if it's enigmatic, and best writing very often is enigmatic, you think, he says that, but does he really mean this? It can be in body language. We talked about camera before. Camera is a great way to show subtext, that a character says something, we think that's innocuous. He says something, we push the camera into a close-up, we're thinking something else is going on here. Music very often speaks to subtext. It seems that this character seems quite happy, but something else is going on with the music to suggest that maybe they're not as happy as we think they are. Editing rhythms. Editing is like music. You do a series of cuts, 1 second, 1 second, 1 second, 1 second, and it has an almost invisible rhythm that we just fall into. We don't think about anymore, or silent rhythm, a silent creation of a rhythm that we don't even have awareness of. And then suddenly, the next shot is up for 6 seconds, 7 seconds, 8 seconds, 9 seconds, and it makes us feel entirely different. It's great. There's a movie called Wait Until Dark with Audrey Hepburn, where she plays a blind woman who has mistakenly picked up a drug delivery at an airport. And the bad drug dealers come to her house to kill her and get the drugs back. And she fights them. And a series of dramas and actions and so on. At one point, she whacks the principal antagonist on the head with an iron skillet, and he drops out of frame. And it's shot anamorphic, 2:3:5, big aspect ratio, much wider than tall. We sometimes shoot films. And she stands up way on the edge of frame, way over here, and facing away from the area of potential action. The area of potential action is a part of the frame where we anticipate action occurring. So if someone's looking this way, this is the area of potential action because I must be looking at something that is approaching me or something I'm going to deal with. So the empty part of the frame we call the area of potential action. But she, even blind as she is, she's still looking away from the area of potential action. And whenever you do that, this composition, the audience gets tense because there's all that empty space. And when it's anamorphic and you're way over that, immediately you think something's going to come in that space. She's on that edge of space. Music. The music's building up to a crescendo. It's rising, rising, like a subtone, rising, rising, rising. The editing's been going 1 second, 1 second, 1 second, 1 hour, half second, half second, half second. Beat, 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 stop. Now she holds this frame for 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 7 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, nothing's happening. Music's building up, area of potential action. She's looking away from it. What's the audience thinking at this point? First of all, what's in the screenplay? She stands. What's in the movie? Asymmetry, increasing music, change in the editing rhythm. Subtext, something's going to happen. Something's going to happen now. She's in danger. And then she looks forward. The frame changes. The music drops off. The audience relaxes. At which point, the guy jumps from the edge of the frame on top of her, and everybody in the audience leaps out of their seat. I reference this because somebody wrote that screenplay, but somebody didn't write that scene. It's two different screenplays. A visual screenplay that uses subtext, that uses visceral element, that uses composition, editing rhythm, music, all these other principles. So as writers, if we don't address any of those things, then any of us could have written that scene. She stands up, but way more happens. So that's the way we think as filmmakers of subtext, of all the other things that we want to express to an audience and thereby engage them.
That's incredible. Something I was thinking, and no better person to ask but yourself, in terms of close-ups and the different camera angles and the selection that can be used, how do you apply them to the scene? Is it all the things you're saying? What do we want to achieve? How does it feel? What are we creating? Who is it we're filming?
What I'll do is, before I do a film, I said don't outline. But once you've not outlined it, you've done the creation of the principal ideas, and it comes time for the application of technical principles to serve those notions you involve through your radical approach to screenwriting or planning. I then create a diagram with columns, and each column is a different area of the filmmaking process. One will be composition, one will be camera movement, one will be lighting, one will be editing, one will be music and sound effects, one will be production design, one will be wardrobe, one will be performance. And then I go to each individual scene and I go, okay, here's a scene, the character's in an earthquake. He's locked in this basement room, and he realizes that the air conditioner shut off. How's he going to get out? Okay, what are we going to do with the camera? Well, first, there's information I've got to convey, so I know what my coverage is. So I talk about what shots I would want to get. But then I'll think, all right, this is a crisis for him. If I do this in wide shot, that subverts performance because we can barely see the actor. Now, seeing a wide shot to establish the physical position of the actor may be important to convey information to the audience. So I may want to put a wide shot in. But do I want to start there? No, I want the audience to feel the same sense of crisis the character does. So I'm going to put a big close-up right at the beginning of this film because I want to show the characters frightened. And in performance, I will give a note to the actor saying, you're about to die, probably, just so you know, okay? And then I'll say to the camera operator, now, when this thing begins to shake and the shaking goes up, and we actually did this in the film, we had these giant devices under the stage with hydraulics and those shaking the stage. So everything was shaking, things were falling. The actor probably was, bless him, quite frightened. At this key moment, I want the camera to push in another 6 inches to suggest that this character is more frightened than they were a moment before. With music, we're using shepherd tones. So we've added it, or just look at the scene, we added a shepherd tone to it. So we create the sense of tension. We have a leitmotif, a musical theme that reminds us of other things in the film that we introduce as well. So we know what the character's thinking. He's thinking about his family, thinking about how everything's becoming, undone. So for all those reasons, I constructed these different elements, and I could say to different departments, camera's going to push in, I need smoke here, I need the shaking, I need whatever it is, production design. I said I want things falling in the background. So we had these shelves full of cans, and then we had these objects outside of set on chains. So as the earthquake becomes worse, things begin falling down behind him. He walks forward, things are falling behind him, and the audience has the sense of, my God, he's about to be buried underground, and all he's thinking about is how the stock price is doing on the monitor. So in the middle of all this, I cut to a shot, his point of view, because we see him looking off camera, and we don't know what he's looking at. Is he looking at the arrival of the angel of death? Is he looking at children? and we just see him staring at something, and he's smiling, and the whole world is falling behind him, and we cut to the reverse, and it's a stock price going up. So we constructed that by these elements, thinking about subtext, thinking about all the point, and that's the way you choose. There's another moment where he has a conversation with his wife, and very, very significant. I could have played it wide. I played it entirely in 2 close-ups because I never wanted the audience to escape from the embarrassing intimacy. She's busting about a lie that he told. And I know that if I cut away to a wide shot, it gives you a relief. If something bad is happening, I'm in Hollywood right now, and I'm looking down on Hollywood Boulevard, the Hollywood sign. If I can show you the reverses, literally to my left, right here, downtown LA, I can see over there the theater where the Oscars is just in front of me here, and I'm up this the top of this building. If as I look out at these things, I could look down and see a drama on Hollywood Boulevard. I could see a demonstration or an argument there, and at a great distance, it doesn't engage me. If I was to go into my living room and my wife said, "Why were you on the phone so long?" She was very angry with me, and we're having an argument face to face. That for an audience is going to be a lot more dramatic and powerful. Simple common sense. But when you're doing a scene, you can't, as a director, simply come in with no plan. Kind of the opposite of writing and say, let's do a wide shot and we'll figure it out later. You just do a wide shot, you're arbitrarily determining what the audience will feel at that moment. If you choose a close-up at a key moment, you're changing the way they perceive the action. So unlike that first stage of the creative process where you're creating and you should be open, once you're on set, you should have a plan. Now, the great thing about having a plan is you can throw the plan away. I plan so precisely so that on the shooting day, if suddenly an actor says, "I don't feel I would go over here, I feel I would go over there," I go, "That's okay, because this day is not going to turn catastrophic if I alter this shot." I've got things so planned out that when the actor has done it 3 or 4 times, I don't feel I'm getting there. I'll say, "You know what? Here's the backstory," and I give them hundreds of pages of backstory. They have some reference to the character. Let's just improvise the next 10 minutes. Drives them crazy, but then we improvise. Sometimes we discover something, sometimes we discover nothing at all, but it alters our understanding of character, and it alters that moment. And as that character is improvising, like I did on Monster, sometimes we'll pick up a handheld camera and we'll discover a shot, but we're so structured and ordered and so responsible in terms of the enormous spending you do on a feature, which can be spending $250,000 a day. You don't want to be showing your producers that you don't have a plan, but very often you don't, and you have to be open to discovery. And you open to discovery because your plan is sound enough that when the discovery goes wrong, you can step back and do your plan and still make your day, which is get all the shots that are scheduled.
Quentin Tarantino said once that, I can't remember who it was, there was someone really quite important within the industry he spoke with, and he said to him, to be a director, you don't need to know how to film. You don't need to be the best camera guy. You don't need to be the best sound guy or the best lighting guy or the best editor. You just need to know those guys that come on the film. Is that true? Would you agree with that?
Quentin, bless him, does say things to be iconoclastic, but it's partially true. I think that if you have no understanding of those other jobs, then you can't be a good director, because people can tell you things that aren't necessarily true. As a cinematographer, I know a lot of old curmudgeonly cinematographers who, when a first-time director says, "I want to do a 360-degree shot," they'll say, "Well, absolutely, we can do it. It's just going to take 9 hours. Are you good with that?" At which point the producers and the director goes, "No, we don't do that." And the DP is successfully convinced them not to do a shot they wanted to do. If you don't know another person's job, you don't know the tools that are available to you. So if you have no understanding of cinematography, you can't say, "I want somehow this person's window to emotionally engage with the audience, but I have no idea how to do it. What do you suggest?" Yeah, if a great cinematographer, it's Roger Deakins, they'll probably come up with a really good idea. But if you've seen hundreds and hundreds and thousands of films, Quentin has, I hope I have, then you can say, in Days of Heaven, that incredible silhouette shot on the trestle at the beginning of the film, which is so effective. Let's look at these films together. What do you think of that? And you can have an informed conversation with someone who may be more expert than you at how to achieve that shot, but can also be inspired by you. So the more you understand the meta languages, the many languages that people use in film, language of composition, language of camera movement, language of lighting, language of music, language of editing, if you equip yourself with some sort of vocabulary, shorthand, you're better able to communicate with those experts than if you have no knowledge at all. And I've got to tell you, Quentin's seen a lot of movies and has worked with a lot of great people and can speak cinematographer, can speak editing, can speak music. I did a film with him in Florida, and we spoke at great length about old movies, and we weren't just talking about the story. So he says that because he likes to be controversial, but Quentin knows pretty much something about everybody's craft.
Phenomenal. I love the way that guy approaches a film. And the reason I brought him up is you remind me of him in your own way. You're a maverick in a sense of you are free. Creativity has no bounds. It's not, it wasn't built in a garden with fences around it. It is there to be explored. And through exploring, we find our greatest creations and creativity because we're not holding ourselves back. And I found similarities. And also, you're very unique in a sense where obviously you know Quentin Tarantino. I don't. But in his background, he first got into acting. I believe his stepfather or father was in acting. And then when he writes, he's writing from an actor's perspective. He's very aware of the scene, the setting, the movements. And that's what gives him, in my opinion, an advantage to someone who just writes. Now, in your case, you come from a very heavy cinematographer background of filming. You see exactly how it's filmed, what you want to convey, and how that's achieved. Those images are what build that screenplay. Because if we go back to the cinema many decades back, and probably not too long ago, it was still known as the pictures. It's pictures we're creating. And I see even though both completely unique in your own rights, great similarities because you understand exactly what you're looking to achieve when it gets to camera, when it gets to set, when it gets to production. Would you agree with that?
It's just flattering, but I agree with it mostly. I would say about Quentin as well is that he had seen a lot of B movies. And you think, oh, B movies, bad movies. Why would you look at bad movies? Bad movies because of budget very often, or because they would have different ambitions than big films were. Very often they were exploitation movies, but they would approach the process of filmmaking entirely different. The relationship to the zeitgeist was actually closer in many respects because it was more from the street, what was actually happening at the time. It wasn't slick Hollywood views. But also went to low-budget films very often would have scenes that would run for 20 minutes because that's all they could afford to do. So when Quentin first wrote Reservoir Dogs, people thought this is bad writing because so much happens in that first scene. How can you do a film that breaks every orthodoxy? McKee would never have approved of that script, as we know. And yet it was brilliant because it was a complex development of characters. And the characters were both real and surreal at the same time. Saying about writing, at the very beginning of this, you have to recognize that which makes us human in any character. And in Quentin's characters, although they are very often seemingly of another universe, there's always a humanity in them as well that we recognize their vulnerabilities, their weaknesses, their complexities. And going to what we were talking about today, you look at Reservoir Dogs and you see a character that is born of life and not just narrative. Those characters aren't just talking about the story that's happening. We're learning a lot about who they are. And, one guy doesn't want to be called Mr. Blue, which is not, doesn't serve Mr. Pink, doesn't serve narrative, but it illustrates the character. And that's what Quentin believes absolutely. So I think what I in my small way share with him, or my friend Noah Baumbach, another great example, who I did 3 films with Noah's first 3 movies, the idea of just throwing things away, and that don't believe the rules and do the art and the thing that best serves your vision. And what best serves your vision is very rarely what other people tell you should do.
Oh, it's beautifully said. You know what's interesting? You mentioned because there was something else in that with Tarantino, because when you were talking about commentary, when you were talking about the depth you go into, he's renowned for doing that too. Do you know? It's like, well, people need to be listening a bit closer. In my opinion, I'm only speaking for myself, Steve. if you have two giants doing something and creating gold, why are we not listening more to that? That's just my opinion. Because
and look at your own Mike Lee as well, which is, again, the idea that character is paramount, and the complexity of character is what interests us. To me, I've got one rule that I start every screenwriting class with, which is that all films are mysteries. Be it a comedy, be it an action, or be it a mystery, all films are mystery. See, the mystery of narrative, how is the person going to achieve or overcome this obstacle or achieve this ambition, or the mystery of character, which is, why is this person behaving in this odd way? We want to find out, as we're going to keep watching until we find out why they behave. That's the way we mediate and experience the world. We meet people, and right away at a party, we're thinking, is this person good, bad? Are they of interest? Are they a creep? Are they someone who's going to serve me? Are they expecting that I'm going to serve them? It's Los Angeles. Are they lying to me? This is the mysteries which is our human experience. And every day, therefore, we wake up trying to figure out the world. If we make films that don't have to be figured out, they're not going to be very compelling. Mike Lee begins happy-go-lucky with Sally Hawkins on a bicycle. She doesn't lock her bike. She goes into a bookstore. She's speaking very cheekily and happily to the store owner, who's a bit sullen. And we're thinking, this woman is really weird. She goes out and she discovers her bike's missing or stolen. She barely registers. She goes, oh, well, and she goes walking off happily. And we're thinking, that's not normal behavior. Who is this person? And we can't stop watching. And that is the way every film should begin, with the mystery of the human condition. Die Hard is another great example, which is, he's in this building. How's he going to get out of this building? It's a mystery. And we're thinking, these are insuperable obstacles. These people are well armed and organized, and he's by himself. It's a mystery. You can say all the action, everything else, and explosions, but I would suggest that we actually surveyed an audience and say, when you look at Die Hard, is it the shooting that you like, or is it the puzzle that he has? How is he going to achieve this ambition of defeating these guys and getting out of this building? It's the puzzle that's compelling. Same thing with every Marvel film. The beginning of, my friend, dropping names left and right, so it's an LA disease, but only because these people are interesting. Jon Favreau, I did his first few films. He's a good friend, and they brought John in to direct Iron Man, the first Iron Man, and Rob Downey is in the SUV or whatever they're driving, the Humvee, and he does an improvisation. So we believe him completely, and he's hilarious, and he's talking about everything not to do with the story. He's talking about the characters. He's talking about the young soldiers. He's talking about his own life. He's being irreverent. He's being completely mad, and he's being human. And right away, we want to know, who the hell is this guy? Why is he so peculiar? Why does he say these things? Why are people responding to him in this way? Why is he in this Humvee? A mystery. It's blowing up, etc. And then later the film becomes less interesting when he becomes Iron Man. But the opening was absolutely brilliant. And to every writer, I would say, understand that the world is a mysterious place. And as writers, we provide a portal to the mystery. But first we have to say, we're writing about the mystery. Let the audience know what the mysteries are, and then we can explore the discovery and understanding of why those things are the way they are in the course of our novel, our poem, our film, whatever it is. Mystery is the thing that drives. If right away we see a character and they're drunk or whatever they are, and they're unhappy, and we've got 2 hours of watching a person being unhappy, yeah, I guess we could say we want to know why the person's unhappy, but first we got to want to know. And if we don't want to know, then we're not going to watch.
Do you believe in that concept of saving the cat at the beginning to get them on, get the audience on side with the protagonist? Do you agree?
I have strong feelings about that particular book, which I won't express out of respect. But I think that empathic connect. Let me put it obliquely. Empathic connection is extremely important in film, in that we have to care about characters. But we can care about characters for lots of different reasons. It can be their virtues, their kindness, their generosities, their heroism, but it can also be their weaknesses. In fact, I would suggest that the more you show a character's weakness, the more likely the audience is to care about them. So there's a misapprehension from Marvel and others that we only care about heroes. Although Marvel's now got it much more together. I think Marvel films are much underrated in terms of writing. The writing actually is quite of a high caliber. And as these Marvel characters have evolved, and other characters as well, it's the complexities and vulnerabilities and weaknesses of characters that actually engages us. So we don't have to do something necessarily heroic. We just have to do something human for audiences to care about us.
Yeah. In your experience, what was it like with, you've done so many films, so many great films. Adam Sandler, from my opinion, my experience growing up, in comedy, it was him and Ben Stiller. It was them two. They ruled everything. That's just from my experience in the background audience watching movies. What makes him so lovable on camera, and what's he like to work with?
Just lovely man, incredibly generous, very loyal. He's still working with people he shared a dormitory room with in university. That's what the quality of his character. Very loving to his parents, to his family, to his daughters. Just a really good person at every possible level. Great collaborator. So he recognizes that film is a collaborative process, that you can't do something unless you're facilitating others. So he certainly protects his own comedy, but then he encourages everyone around him to take risks. One of the things we're talking about, to understand that they're protected, that they'll be nurtured and loved, that they could fall on their face, not in a comic pratfall, but just by taking a risk on a performance, and he's still going to laugh. The sets were full of laughter and generosity, and an organized chaos. Everything would be tried on Waterboy and on Bulletproof, and he was just a lot of fun. Same thing with the Wayans. Just the sets are fun, and that's not an accident. The happiest sets I've been on are the films that have been most successful. I got an American Society of Cinematography nomination for outstanding cinematography on a series called Magic City, and that was the happiest set I've ever been on. Everybody loved everybody, and so it engendered risk taking. It engendered people being in a position of safety whereby they could say, "Let me try this," and if they got it wrong, there wouldn't be a sense of criticism. Patty Jenkins, we talked about before, incredibly generous and kind, strong, but at the same time would facilitate. Jon Favreau, again, one of the nicest people I know in the planet. I mean, along with Adam, along with Keenan Ivory Wayans. What's common to all these people is they're great leaders. And they're great leaders not because they're martinets and got a riding crop and screaming at people, which is the illusion, some odd cultural illusion that leaders are cruel or frightening or intimidating. They're the opposite. They create, all of them, a sense of family on set. And when you have a sense of family, you feel safe. And when you feel safe, you do your best work. And to the directors who don't recognize that, and I'm not mentioning any names, but some who do huge action films who are famous for screaming across sets, yeah, they still make films that make money. But I would argue that they could be better films were they better leaders of people.
Yeah, I like that. I totally agree. I believe as a leader, I think it's you said it so well in terms of being strong but generous and fair. That's the balance. That's very hard to do, because it's almost to be within the mindset of standing up for yourself and being powerful in a situation versus almost sensing the vulnerability in someone else and being softer and more gentle. That is a skill. That's a huge skill to be able to flip. I've always believed very hard to do.
Very hard. I completely agree. And it's the hardest thing to do. And it's freeing yourself of ego, because very often you have to say to somebody when you've actually done the work that they did the work. Sometimes you have to recognize that others have to be recognized to make you greater. And I discovered that long ago, a little speech I make to crews at the beginning of films. I said, I'll always give you credit, because don't worry, when the film's finished and we're on the red carpet, despite my best efforts, everyone's going to be giving me credit for your work anyway. So I'm happy while we're shooting to give you all the credit, because the way this industry is set up, I'll get plenty of recognition later if the film is good. So all I care about is the film is good, and you guys can do whatever you want as long as it's serving the film. But these are the things that are part of leadership, and filmmaking and directing is partially leadership. It's not just writing a script and directing actors, it's inspiring people to be greater than themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I'm quite interested to know, I don't know if you do, but I'd be shocked if you don't. What's one of the favorite scenes you've ever filmed where you loved it?
There's so many, and I do have lots of favorite scenes, but it's 100 odd movies now. There's a fight sequence in an elevator in Murder 1600 with Wesley Snipes, where he beats up two guys, and we shot it handheld in a faux elevator. And as we shot it, so the camera would be positioned, we were dropping the walls of the elevator in, shoot, and as the action moved, we moved the wall back in. So it would seem like everything was shot within the elevator, but the elevators were swinging up and swinging down while we shot it, and we had to choreograph it to work in a small space. That was incredible. The airplane sequence crashing on the 3rd Street Bridge or on SWAT, that was great fun. Another one from Murder 1600, we had an underground chase in the sewers beneath the White House, which we built that entire thing on a stage in Toronto, and that was a lot of fun. There's a scene in Monster where Charlize and Christina are just having a drive together, and Christina puts her hand out the window and plays with the wind that blows across her hand. It's just a moment of inspiration. We just wanted to have a sense that she has a childlike quality to her. So I remember just saying, Christina, put your hand out. And then she just improvised, and Patty was delighted by that. That was a lot of fun. The scene where Charlize says goodbye to Christina, knowing that she's about to betray her at the train station in Monster, where the grip was, at that point, had been very rough and tumble, covered in ink, and seemingly not a very nice person, big as a house, approached us and said that the crew had decided they wanted to facilitate the performance from Christina and Charlize. So what if nobody spoke for the entire day and we just worked with hand signals to create the atmosphere that might serve performance? So nobody spoke. And we shot the scene with hand signals of these two actresses saying goodbye to each other. The only sound I heard in the middle of this was somebody quietly sobbing. And it was a slow pushing on a dolly as the two women say goodbye. And we realized that one is betraying the other. And I looked around to see who was crying. And there was this tatted up giant, big as a house, dolly grip, who was pushing the dolly, watching the scene, and sobbed uncontrollably. So that was kind of a magical moment. There's a sequence in Like Water for Chocolate, which is the rose petal scene, where she puts rose petals, makes everyone fall in love with each other. And we shot that with like 3 lights, and we had like 15 people. And we were the very limit of exposure. And when it came out, I remember dailies thinking it was incredible. We ran out of film stock while we were shooting that film. And we started with Agfa, then we shot with Kodak, then we shot with Fuji. And so everything has a slightly different grain and color pattern, cut it together. And I was at a film festival in New York, and people were raving about the film at this point. Critic came up to me and said, I said, so I noticed what you did in that rose petal scene, how you changed the nature of the film for each character. So each thing was speaking about the character in a different way. So that wasn't what I was doing, but I was so delighted that it was received that way that I enjoyed that as well. There's so much we did with the Wayans that just makes me laugh out loud. Terry Crews got discovered by the Wayans. Scene where someone asked him to sign an autograph. He says, turn around, and he's writing on the back. And he writes it, and he puts the pen in the guy's back. It was a bit of magical bit of improvisation. Terry's first scene in that movie, with the dance scene, where he has to, as he's taking his own roofie and he's dancing wildly with his shirt off. We didn't know he was going to do that. We just flown him up from Los Angeles as kind of a minor actor, and he improvised that dance. And Keenan and I just looked at it, pointed all the cameras at him, and just let him run. We intended to replace him with a body double. And that was a moment of film magic that I'll never forget, because everyone was so stunned. After he finished the dance, there was a moment of silence. And then 600 people watching all burst in spontaneous applause. It's been 40 years of filmmaking, and most of it's been a great deal of fun. So hundreds of experiences. all of which have been, great. I remember the film that Quentin produced, Curdled, in Florida. I remember this is about a cleaner who comes in after forensic examiners have finished and clears away the blood and body parts and so on. So she does a dance where she dances through all the different rooms of the house while she cleans up the body parts. And that was on a Steadicam, and we had to move the lights as we went, but it was hilarious and funny and beautiful. And then there was a scene on the last film, Last Call, with Rhys Ifans, plays Dylan Thomas, where he's been naming drinks after life experiences and insights he's gained in the human condition while he drinks himself to death in a Whitehorse Tavern. And the bartender says to him, "You're just a pitiful drunk, and all this naming you've done sounds grand, but it's not something no one's going to remember, and you can't even remember it." The bartender leaves. And then in one take, one shot, Rhys names all 20 drinks and the meaning for each one from beginning to end in a 7-minute long take of absolute acting magic. So that, I think, is the one that stands out among all others because of the performance, because of how hard it was to get Rhys there for that performance, Rhys's courage in doing it. And then tragically, as we got to the cutting room, Chris Gill looks great, really cool that he did all that. But it would work better if we just cut it up a little bit. So I betrayed my dear friend Rhys Ifans, and we cut it up, but he did it. And it was one of the most magic moments in a film that I've ever, you could hear a pin drop as he did this long 7-minute diatribe. It's magic.
Wow. What is the difference? Play script, screenplay. What are the main differences between writing either one of those?
So between screenplay and
a play script. So between a play and a screenplay, what are the differences?
Well, many similarities, of course, but the main difference is the tableau where this thing's going to end up. So when you're writing a play, you know that you're limited by what you can do theatrically. You also know that the social contract between an audience in a theater and the audience in a cinema are very different. In the theater, we fully expect a temporal suspension of disbelief. It's simply going to happen that whatever we present to the audience, they're going to accept. If there's 2 boxes on stage and we say a building in New York, the audience will accept the building in New York. That measure of verisimilitude is very different in cinema. And when you say New York, you better show them New York, unless you're Lars von Trier, the audience is not going to believe you. And that extends to performance as well. In cinema, there's an expectation that we're seeing life as it is, with complex language and subtext, sometimes mumbling, and people not projecting, and lots of other bits of physicality that are the way the world is actually experienced by us. In theater, we expect a certain theatricality. We don't mind seeing the mechanisms of performance. In fact, we admire it. People say, I think unfairly about Al Pacino, is that the delight in his performance is not necessarily to believe the character he's playing, because you rarely do anymore. You just look at Al Pacino and go, wow, he's really good at acting, isn't he? But you're very aware that it's Al Pacino acting, which is enjoyable, but different from being completely absorbed in a story where you believe that the people, the actors, are the characters. And that's kind of the way it is in theater. You don't necessarily believe that this is Cyrano de Bergerac or this is Richard III, but you still marvel the ability to use glottal fry or phrasing or projection or gesture. And for all its contrivances, we delight in the presentation of the skill set. It's like watching American football. You don't necessarily root for a team. You may arbitrarily decide to, but you can switch it on and you marvel at the skill set. Wow, he's really good at that. Doesn't mean that you're engaged in their narrative, but you marvel at the skill, like ballet, like a painting. You don't necessarily engage, but you marvel at its creation by another human. And that's like performance in theater, in that when you see a great performance, when you see a musical, and you hear the singing, you don't believe for a second that people break into song generally about subtext at some key moment, but you marvel at their ability to do it. And I think that's the way, at least I write for theater differently, in that I write theatrically. I write in big, grand ways so that actors can really let loose and just delight an audience in their abilities rather than their belief in character.
Yeah, I love that. I read once that the difference between acting on stage to acting in a movie is, in a movie, it's subtle expressions, subtle movements. In theatre, it's obviously, it can be melodramatic. It's an overextension. It's more inviting into the action, in that you're creating an energy, where on a movie it's more subtle. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, no, unequivocally, depending on the movie, of course, because sometimes you want the film to be, if it's a period film in particular, your performance changes dramatically for some weird reason. People in the 18th century suddenly speak in this very formal, odd style, and all those contrivances about encoding performance when you do period films is fascinating, because we don't know the way people spoke exactly in the 18th century, but we create, I mean, we have novels and plays, we have some idea, but I'm sure that's not the way people spoke. You never hear anybody swear really in 18th century film. I'm sure they swore all the time, using the same words we use now, but very rarely do you see that. I mean, they create some false, sort of curse, which is God's wounds. And I'm sure that they spoke that occasionally. Occasionally they said the occasional fuck as well, but never in this film. And then when you do films in other countries, as well as Complexity of Mind, I'm writing a script about the Greek Revolution. And I find myself writing this sort of faux Greek speech pattern, but in English. But, I'm sure it's completely absurd, but it's just one of those fascinating contrivances of writing and of thinking about art, is how do we have people speaking different languages? Theoretically, they should be speaking in Greek, or 19th century Greek, but we can't do that and get the market that we want to get. I mean, Tom Cruise in Valkyries, playing a German officer entirely in English, but the other characters all spoke with German accents, but in English for some reason. These things are all fascinating, but it goes also to the relationship of theater and film, about how the way we choose to have people speak. There's some subtext there, something we're saying to the audience about, this is not your world, this is a different world. It may be, but is the portrayal of a different world the way that world actually was, or is that unimportant?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of Chat GPT, what's your thoughts?
By the way, I've got to go in a minute, by the way, so we're a little bit, I got to deliver a script, which I don't want to do, but I must. So fascinating you mentioned that. The person who you may be speaking to shortly is fascinated by that. It's had a huge impact here. I will say this about it. Going back to Save the Cat, although it's a bad example, but the principle is important. We go to theater and we read books and we look at films for many reasons, but one of the most important is so that we know we're not alone, that others have suffered as we have suffered, have loved as we have loved, have had loss as we have had loss. Others are journeyers, as like we are, looking for understanding, insight into meaning, trying to make sense of the complexity of the human experience. That's one of the things, and I would say the principal things, that draws us to art. When the thing creating that art is not human and hasn't suffered as we have suffered, haven't loved as we have loved, hasn't lost as we have lost, but does an imitation of that and pushes the buttons that it suspects will elicit a response, but in its authorship we know it's inauthentic. Ultimately, it will never have the same impact or value to the audience that a living, breathing writer will have. It doesn't mean that it can't create structure and order and dialogue that seems to bear some resemblance to the way people speak. Maybe not Greek people in the 18th century or Germans fighting the Second World War, but the way people speak. But that doesn't mean that in its inauthenticity, it's going to have an impact that people who love technology believe that it will. And why do people love technology? Because the world is a place that is not predictable. It is capricious and dangerous. And when we switch on a computer or have an algorithm or a program, it's safe because its behavior is defined by the information and by the controls we offer it. So to every studio head who has a problem with a writer, the idea that there's going to be a program that can create the successful film they want, I think they're going to be very disappointed. I think ultimately when people realize that something's not been written by a human, they're not going to buy into it because they basically want to hear that secret voice speak to them saying, I know you're suffering. This is my experience. You're not alone. Here's a strategy to how to survive. No machine's going to tell us that. Doesn't mean it doesn't have use as an essay or writing an article about Tottenham's future victories over Arsenal or whatever. I'm sure it can write journalistically, but to create art, it may be capable, but I'm not sure effective.
I agree. I agree with everything you just said. I love that. You speak really well, and I actually knew from listening. I listened to several of your interviews, and I thought this guy isn't just American. He's been in England. He's either born in England or there's something that's gone on here because it's the way you speak. There's a twinge. I can't do it, but you've got a very alluring accent the way you speak because it throws you off. I like it. I love the way you speak and the words you use. I listen carefully, Steve. But I know that you have a tremendous amount to do with your day now. And I started this conversation by introducing you as a legend. I now conclude this conversation by parting with you as a legend. In my opinion, you definitely are. And I think for everything we just discussed, it upholds that. Thank you for your time and patience in speaking with me today.
My great pleasure. I think what you're doing is really interesting and important. So I fully support and wish you well. Thank you.